4,400 years ago, in a city of mud brick towers in southern Iraq, a young scribe pressed his stylus into wet clay and wrote a story down. The story he wrote has only just been read. Until 2024, no one had translated the whole of it. The tablet had sat in a drawer in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums for 130 years, and before that, in the dirt of a buried city for nearly 4 millennia. Generations of scholars looked at it, photographed it, and set it aside. The script was too old, the signs too ambiguous, the clay broken in places that mattered. What it says, when read in full, is something none of them quite expected. This is the only known story about a Sumerian storm god ever written. In all the millions of lines of cuneiform that survive from 4,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, this single fragment tells the story of Ishkur, the rain, the thunder, the god who was on this clay taken to the place from which nothing returns. And it is the story of what happened when his father called the assembly of the great gods and asked who would go down and bring him back. What happened was silence. Hold that with me, slowly. The Anunnaki, who in the surviving Sumerian texts decree the fates of mankind, who hold the tablets of destiny, who in nearly every other line of cuneiform are the great ones, the highest. They did nothing. They sat. The king stood before them and asked his question, and the silence stretched in the room of the gods until it became a kind of pressure. Then, from somewhere lower in the room, a small voice answered. Not a god's voice, a fox, a small four-legged creature whose name, in the oldest writing on earth, was the same wedge mark that meant lie, the same sign as treachery, a creature so embedded in the idea of cunning that the Sumerians could not separate the two. Animal and trick, one sign in the clay, the cleverest creature in their stories, the only one who said, "I will go." What the fox found, what he carried, what he did at the gate of the underworld is preserved on the tablet. But what happened after he reached the place he was going, whether he succeeded, whether the storm god was freed, whether the rain came back, whether the children stopped vanishing into the dark below, that part of the story is gone, somewhere between the moment the scribe set down his stylus and the moment an archaeologist carried it out of the dirt of southern Iraq in the late 19th century, the lower portion of the tablet crumbled away. The most patient story ever written by human beings will not tell us how it ends. It has been holding its breath for 4,400 years. Tonight we'll read this together, slowly. There's no need to rush, just relax and let the story unfold. To understand what was found, you have to understand what was waiting. In the late 1800s, in the south of what is now Iraq, in the ruins of a city older than memory, a city called Nippur, archaeologists were carrying clay out of the sand. Bricks, steely, small fragments of writing, tens of thousands of them. The ground was so saturated with broken text that workers were said to step on tablets, crush them underfoot, throw them aside as rubble. It is hard to say how much writing came out of Nippur. It is harder still to say how little of it has ever been read. Nippur was smaller than some of its neighbours and poorer than others, but it carried something the bigger cities did not. It was the city of Enlil, the king of the gods, the wind lord, the stormbringer, the one who held the office of lordship over the universe. Kings from rival cities travelled to Nippur to seek his blessing at the great temple, the Ekur, mountain house, the name meant, because the Sumerians imagined Enlil's seat as a mountain rising at the centre of the world, even though their world was the flat alluvial plain. To be crowned at Nippur was, for a Sumerian king, the equivalent of being crowned by the highest religious authority in the land. So Nippur became something more than a city. It became a library, a scribal school, a repository. The temple collected texts the way a national archive collects documents, and the schools copied them, taught them, multiplied them. Generation after generation of young students sat in courtyards with wet clay in their hands and pressed the words of older traditions into new tablets, and stored them, and lost some, and copied others again. The Sumerians had a word for the scribal school, eduba, tablet house. Inside, students worked through standardized curricula, copying lists of words, lists of gods, mathematical exercises, hymns, proverbs, and at the more advanced level, full literary compositions. When the city was finally abandoned, long after Sumer itself had ceased to be a living civilization, the tablets stayed in the ground. They stayed there for about 2,000 years. Then, in the late 19th century, expeditions arrived from Europe and the United States. They cut into the mound the way archaeologists of that period cut into mounds, not gently. The University of Pennsylvania sent 4 expeditions to Nipper between 1888 and 1900, under directors who would become famous in the field, John Henry Haynes and Herman Hilprecht among them. They worked in conditions that were difficult and often hostile, with quarrels among Ottoman officials, local sheikhs and one another. But despite all of this, tens of thousands of tablets came out of the mound, packed into crates, shipped away. Some went to Philadelphia, some to Berlin, some to Baghdad, and some by an accident of Ottoman administration went to Istanbul, placed in drawers. Given catalogue numbers, they began another long sleep. One of those tablets was given the number NI12501. The NEA stands for Nipper Istanbul. The number was simply its position when the collection was inventoried. It is small, about the size of a hand, roughly 13 by 12 centimetres, reassembled from several broken pieces. The lower portion was never recovered. The writing was pressed into the clay in slanting wedge strokes, in one of the earliest forms of cuneiform. The signs are dense, archaic, frequently ambiguous, the kind of writing that even trained scholars find hard to interpret. This is not the smooth, classical Sumerian of 1500 years later. It is the rougher, older Sumerian of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, a period scholars call Early Dynastic 3b, roughly 2400 to 2500 years before the birth of Christ. Pause for a moment and feel the weight of that number. 2400 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza had already been built, finished more than 100 years earlier. Writing itself was perhaps 8 centuries old. Bronze had only just begun to displace copper in many regions. There was no Hebrew Bible yet, not for another 1,000 years. No Iliad, no Odyssey, no Buddha, no Socrates, no Confucius. The world we recognise as ancient Greece and Rome and China had not yet begun. The tablet that became Enal Hisron 12501 was pressed into wet clay in a world where the pyramids of Giza were already standing. It belonged to a world we have lost almost completely. Now consider the path of that piece of clay from then to now, from the schoolroom in Nippur where it was first pressed, to whatever shelf it sat on. To the moment when the city was abandoned and the building collapsed on top of it, to the slow burial under wind-blown dust over centuries, to the drilling spades of 19th century archaeologists, the wooden crate, the steamship, the warehouse in Istanbul, the long quiet of a museum drawer. Through every century of those 4,400 years, it carried a story it could not tell. Sometime in the early 1950s, a man named Samuel Noah Kramer encountered it. If you have heard any history of Sumer at all, you have heard his name. By the middle of the 20th century, Kramer was the most important translator and popularizer of Sumerian literature in the world. He spent more than 50 years bent over tablets in 3 countries, pulling stories out of the clay. We owe him authoritative translations of the Sumerian flood myth and of the descent of Inanna. He brought to a wider readership the lullabies sung to crying babies in the 3rd millennium BCE. The love poem he called the oldest in the world, the first laments for the dead, the first school essays. He once said that history begins at Sumer, and then he wrote a book with that title to prove it. On one of his trips to the Istanbul museums, Kramer was looking through the drawers of unstudied tablets when he came across NI 12501. He photographed it, he read parts of it, and he noticed something unusual. The tablet contained a story he did not recognise, a story he could not match to any known myth. The protagonists were familiar. Enlil was there, the king of the gods, a storm god, captured in some kind of trouble, a divine assembly being summoned, and then, oddly, a fox volunteering, a fox descending into the underworld. This was not a copy of an existing myth, not a fragment of something already known. A standalone story, in a Sumerian even older than most of what Kramer was used to reading. He could not finish it. The script was too old. Many of the characters could mean 3 or 4 different things, and without parallel text to check against, he could not decide which meaning the scribe had intended. The clay was broken in critical places. The narrative kept slipping through his fingers, so he set it aside, saying in effect that someone, someday, would have to come back. Then he did one strange thing. In 1956, he published a popular book called From the Tablets of Sumer, a beautifully written introduction to the literature of the oldest civilization on Earth. On the dust jacket, front and centre, he placed a photograph of a small broken clay tablet. It was NI 12501. Perhaps fascination, perhaps instinct, perhaps the recognition of something unique. He chose to display the very tablet no one had ever fully translated, on the cover of a book read in dozens of countries by tens of thousands of curious readers. But he did not, on the cover, write its catalogue number. Anyone struck by the photograph, anyone who wanted to find that exact tablet, would not know where it lived. Famous as an image, anonymous as an artifact, visible to everyone, identifiable to no one. 5 years later, in a more academic publication, Kramer revealed the museum number. By then, the popular readers had moved on. The tablet had been seen and forgotten. And because of that gap, those 5 years, Anunnaki 12501 became hidden in plain sight. The years passed. Other Sumerologists came and went. A few studied transliterations of the readable lines. Now and then a reference appeared in a footnote. The clearest portions of the text were translated by various scholars over the decades. But for 70 years no one sat down with the entire tablet, top to bottom, beginning to end, broken edges included, and read it as a single text. The reasons were practical. Old script, severe fragmentation in the parts that mattered, strange vocabulary, and there was always more famous material to work on. The descent of Inanna, Gilgamesh, the flood, the hymns to the temples, thousands of tablets known to be more complete, with clearer rewards waiting in them. NI 12501 kept its story. Years passed, decades passed, generations of scholars passed, and the tablet in its quiet did not move. It was waiting for someone who could read it. Her name is Jana Matusak. Today she is an assistant professor of Sumerology at the University of Chicago, working at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, among colleagues who can spend their entire careers on a single Sumerian noun. Her specialty is the exact specialty N I12501 needed. Most people who read Sumerian read the classical form of the language, the form written between roughly 2000 and 1700 BCE. That is the Sumerian of Gilgamesh, of the great hymns, of the descent of Inanna. But by the time those texts were written, Sumerian had stopped being a language anyone spoke at home. This is one of the strangest facts about the Sumerians. Their language died, really died, somewhere around the year 2000 BCE, the way Latin died as a living tongue. The conquerors who came after them spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. Akkadian replaced Sumerian on the streets, in the markets, in the homes. But Sumerian did not vanish. It became sacred. The way Latin remained sacred to the medieval church, the way Sanskrit remained the priestly language of India, the way Hebrew remained the language of liturgy long after Aramaic had taken over daily life. After its death as a living language, Sumerian became the language of scribes and scholars and priests, of anyone who wanted to read the old records, write hymns to the old gods, copy the old myths. The young Akkadian-speaking scribes of Babylon learned Sumerian the way medieval European students learned Latin, by rote, by copying, by memorizing word lists and arguing with their teachers about the correct pronunciation of words their grandparents had never spoken. There survives, from the Old Babylonian period, an entire genre of bilingual lexical lists, in which a Sumerian word would be written down in one column and its Akkadian equivalent in the next. Textbooks of the dead language, used to teach generation after generation of students how to read what was already, even then, ancient. The vast bulk of Sumerian literature that survives to us was written down by people for whom Sumerian was already a foreign language. Modern scholars are in much the same position those Babylonian students were in, reading a language nobody has spoken in 4,000 years. Reading it well, but reading it through a long, long lens. That lens had to be ground from scratch. By the time European scholars first encountered cuneiform, the script had been completely forgotten. When travellers brought copies of Persian inscriptions back in the 17th and 18th centuries, no one alive could read them. The breakthrough came in the early 1800s, when a German schoolteacher named Georg Friedrich Grotefend, working from an old Persian inscription at Persepolis, identified the names of 3 Persian kings and worked out the sound values of about a dozen signs. The Old Persian script was alphabetic, with relatively few signs. The harder forms, Akkadian and Sumerian, with hundreds of signs each, would take decades more. The next great breakthrough came at Behistun, in the mountains of western Iran, where an English officer named Henry Rawlinson spent years scaling a sheer cliff face to copy a massive trilingual inscription left by Darius the Great. Working out the Persian section gave Rawlinson the key to the Akkadian. By the 1850s, Akkadian could be read, and by the 1860s scholars realised that buried inside Akkadian texts were references to an even older language the Akkadians themselves had treated as ancient. That language was Sumerian. Reading it took longer still. Scholars had to work backwards through bilingual lexical lists, Akkadian translations of older Sumerian hymns, the painstaking comparison of fragments. By the time Kramer began his career in the early 20th century, Sumerian was readable, but barely. By the time Matusak began hers in the early 21st, the field had matured enormously. Grammars existed, dictionaries existed, thousands of edited texts existed. But the fundamental difficulty had not gone away. The script had stabilised in classical Sumerian around the early 2nd millennium BCE. Anything earlier was harder to read, sometimes much harder. NI 12501 belongs to the period before any of that, before Sumerian became a sacred language, before the standard grammar was fixed, before the Babylonian scribes had ironed out the ambiguities of the script. It is written in the rough, fluid, half-formed cuneiform of the 3rd millennium BCE, when a single sign could carry several different sounds, several different meanings, and the reader had to use context to decide which. To read it, you have to do something almost impossibly difficult. You have to know the later Sumerian first, really know it. You have to know how the script eventually settled, which signs came to mean what in the classical form of the language, and then you have to work backwards. You have to look at an early dynastic sign and ask, when this scribe pressed this stroke, what could he have meant? What was the range of options? Which choice would make sense given the surrounding context? Reverse engineering across thousands of years, forensic linguistics performed on the dead. This is what Jana Matusak does for a living. When she talks about the work, what comes through is patience, not impatience, not the rush of a discovery. The slow, careful, almost surgical patience of a person who has learned to sit with ambiguity, to weigh signs against each other, to wait for the structure of a passage to reveal itself. Because of the ambiguities of the cuneiform script, she said in an interview after her translation was published, the devil is really in the details. She studied NI 12501 for a long time before she felt confident in her reading, comparing it to other texts of the same period, testing possible meanings against the surrounding lines, rebuilding grammatical structures the way one might rebuild a piece of pottery from broken shards, laying out every possibility, eliminating those that did not fit, slowly assembling something that held its shape. What she translated at the end of that process was published in 2024 in a journal called Iraq from Cambridge University Press. The article carried the dry precision of academic writing. Of captive storm gods and cunning foxes, new insights into early Sumerian mythology, with an edition of Ni 12501. It was the first complete edition of the tablet ever published, the first time anyone had translated the beginning, the first time anyone had translated the end of the surviving portion. The first time the readable text, about a third of the original, was set down in modern English, line by line with notes and commentary. When she finally read it as a continuous narrative, what she found was unlike anything else in the surviving body of Sumerian literature. A story about a god who, in every other text, plays only a minor role. A story whose central image was a moment of silence in a divine assembly, a moment of refusal, a moment when the most powerful beings in the Sumerian universe were asked to descend, and not one of them moved. After all these centuries, that moment finally rose out of the clay. Now it can be told, so let's go back. Not to the tablet, to the world the tablet describes, the world before the silence began. Close your eyes for a moment, if you are not already drifting towards sleep. We are going to walk together into a landscape. The landscape is not modern. It is not Iraq as it is today. It is older than that. Older than oil. Older than nation-states. Older than Islam. Older than Christianity. Older than Judaism. Older than the alphabet. Older than the wheel as a public technology. This is the world the Sumerians lived in, 4,400 years ago. A world of mud, water, grass, sky, and running through everything, two great rivers, the Tigris in the east, the Euphrates in the west. Together, in their slow-flowing south toward the Persian Gulf, they made the floodplain of the world's first cities. This is the world the tablet begins in. Its very first lines, the lines no one had ever fully read until 2024, describe abundance, not conflict, not battle, not dissent. The story opens with a portrait of a world in fullness, rivers running with water, water running with fish, the fish silvering and thrashing under the surface, cattle grazing on the grass beside the rivers, and not ordinary cattle, multicoloured cattle. The Sumerian phrase suggests herds of mixed coats, dappled and spotted and brown and white and black, full and content and unhurried, rich grass, plentiful water, a sky full of light. This was the Sumerian image of paradise, not gold, not jewels, not palaces, water and grass and animals and fish. In a country where the desert was always one bad year away, where every harvest depended on whether the canals had been dug right, and whether the floods had come at the right time, and whether the wind had blown the salt away from the soil, abundance was a religious image. To picture rivers full of fish was to picture the gods being kind. The Sumerians knew their abundance was fragile. To the south, where the Tigris and Euphrates met before joining the Gulf, lay the great marshes. Hundreds of square kilometres of slow brown water, reed beds taller than men, channels wide enough for small reed boats to push through, full of fish and birds and wild pigs and the buffalo the marsh peoples kept for milk. To the north and west, just beyond the irrigated fields, the desert began. Dry, salt-streaked, unforgiving. A bad year of wind could blow that desert into the fields, bury the canals, ruin the harvests for a generation. The Sumerians had seen it happen. Their literature contains long laments for cities destroyed by drought, by salinization, by the slow ecological exhaustion that came when the canals were not maintained or the rains failed. So when the tablet begins with abundance, it is showing you something the Sumerians knew could be lost. Stand on the bank of one of those rivers. Let the wind move across your face. The wind in southern Mesopotamia comes off the marshes in the south, carrying the smell of reeds and water and mud, and sometimes, when it has come a long way, the cleaner smell of the desert behind it. Look at the water. The water is not just water. The water is the gift of a god. In the Sumerian way of seeing, every natural force was the act of a divine person. The wind was Enlil. The fresh water under the earth, bubbling up in springs, was Enki. The sun crossing the sky was Utu. The moon was Nana. The morning star was Inanna. The earth itself was Ki. The sky was An. Each of these had a name, a temple, a city, a family, a personality. The world was alive with their decisions, and the rain belonged to a god whose name was Ishkur. You will not have heard much about Ishkur. He is one of the lesser gods. In southern Mesopotamia, where most of the surviving texts come from, his importance was limited because the south did not depend on rain. It depended on irrigation. The two great rivers were tapped by canals, and the canals fed the fields, and the fields produced the barley and the wheat that fed the cities. Rain was helpful, but not the difference between life and death. So Ishkur in the south was a smaller figure. Real, prayed to, named in lists but not central. The great gods of the south were Enki of the deep waters, Enlil of the wind, An of the sky, Inanna of love and war. Further north and west, where rainfall was the main source of agricultural water, storm gods were enormously important. The Semitic peoples to the north revered a storm god called Hadad, also called Adad. The figure later cultures would call Baal. The Bible would mention him many times. In Akkadian myths, Adad rides a chariot pulled sometimes by lions, brandishing a fork of lightning. Where surviving images show a storm god in Mesopotamian art, this is the image: the bearded figure, the lightning fork, the bull at his feet, the rain pouring around him. In Sumer the same kind of god existed, but quieter, smaller, local. His name was Ishka. In this tablet and in a handful of other surviving sources, he was understood as the son of Enlil. The Sumerian pantheon was not always consistent about parentage. Some traditions made Ishkur the son of An, the sky father. Some made him the son of Nana, the moon. But in NI 12501, the lineage is clear. Ishkur is Enlil's son, and that relationship is the engine of the whole story. He was the rain that fell in Nippur in the rare months when it fell at all, the thunder over the marshes in the spring, the surge that made the canals deepen and the new grass spring up. When Sumerians swore oaths involving storms, they swore by him. When they prayed for rain in the lean years, they prayed to him. When his bull-shaped image was carried in a procession, it went with the music of small drums, the way thunder is announced by a low rolling rumble before it arrives. Almost everywhere we read about him, he is a minor god. No surviving epic, no hymn cycle, no protagonist role in any of the famous myths, except this one, except NI 12501, the single tablet on which the storm god of southern Mesopotamia is at the centre of the story. What does it tell us? It tells us that Ishkur was taken. The image is sudden after the picture of abundance. The rivers are full, the cattle are content, the fish glitter. And then the tablet breaks open into a different kind of language, a language of disappearance. Ishkur with his cattle has been taken to the Kur. Taken, not killed, not dead. Taken. Carried down to the place from which nothing returns. Down, below, into the country where the dead live in the dust and eat clay. Into the place where, once you go, the doors close behind you. The Sumerians had many names for it. Kur, which originally meant mountain, and came, over time, to mean the underworld. Irkalla, Arali, Ganzir. Most powerfully Kunugia, the country from which there is no return. It was not hell, not punishment. It was simply where you went after you died. Everyone went there. Kings, slaves, priests, children. Everyone, in the end, ended up below. The conditions were not pleasant. Sumerian descriptions of the underworld are some of the bleakest in any ancient literature. A place of dust, of birds with wings sewn shut, of food made of dirt, of no light, no music, no joy. But it was not, in the Sumerian imagination, a moral judgment. It was the country we all became citizens of when we died. And the storm god was now there, a god among the dead, caught in a place not made for him, a god whose nature was the open sky, the booming clouds, the rain on the grass, held now in the dark beneath the soil with the dead. That is where the tablet goes next, down with him, into the consequences. When a storm god is taken, the rain stops. This is the simple, terrible mechanic of Sumerian religion. The rain falls because Ishkur sends it. The thunder rolls because his voice is moving. With him gone, nothing comes from the sky. The tablet describes what happens above after he disappears below. You can almost see the same fields you stood beside a moment ago. The fields where the grass was thick, the riverbanks where the water shone in the sun, the marshes where the fish were thrashing. Now see them as the months go by. The grass yellows first. That is always how it begins. A green that turns gold, and at first this looks like late summer, like harvest, like something to be celebrated. But the gold deepens, brown, brittle. The grass that was thick under the cattle's hooves becomes thin and dry, and then it is gone. The river drops, not all at once, slowly. Each week the water line a little farther down the bank. Mud that was wet now cracking. Mud that was cracking now stone hard. The fish smaller, then fewer, then none. Cattle are killed for meat that no one will need next month. Dogs, hungry, become aggressive. Children, smaller than the adults, eat less. Mothers say, with the false calm that mothers say everything, that there will be food next week. There is no food next week. This is what the tablet describes. But the tablet does not describe it the way you have just heard. The tablet describes it in poetry. In a phrase Matusak translated for the first time, children are born and they are carried off to the Kur. That is the Sumerian way of saying mass infant mortality. The most vulnerable people in any society, the newborns, the small ones, the toddlers, are the first to die in a famine. They have the least reserves. They cannot survive on smaller rations. When the food runs out, the small ones go first. The tablet describes this not as a medical fact, but as an action. The Kur is reaching up. The land of no return is taking. Children born in the world of light are not staying long enough to know it. The dark below is hungry, and the dark below is winning. It is one of the saddest images in surviving Sumerian literature. It is also, scholars believe, an image rooted in real lived experience. Drought was not a poetic abstraction in southern Mesopotamia. It was a periodic disaster. Civilizations rose and fell on the basis of rainfall patterns. The lament for the destruction of Ur, written some centuries after NY 12501, describes a world in which the canals are clogged, the fields are bitter, the storehouses are empty, and the people lie in the streets unburied. The Sumerians knew, in their bones, what a serious drought looked like. When the scribe of N1 12501 wrote about a world without the storm god, he was not writing fantasy. He was writing about something many of his listeners had seen with their own eyes. Real, ongoing horror, dressed in the language of myth. And the people prayed. Of course they prayed. They went to their temples, lit their incense, brought their offerings, prayed to the storm god to come back, prayed to his father, the king of the gods, prayed to anyone who might listen. The tablet's first long passage, the abundance turning into the drought building into the disappearance of the children, is, in a sense, the rising voice of that prayer. The world is dying. Someone has to act. The natural balance has been broken. The god who keeps the rain coming is gone. The land cannot hold itself together without him. In Sumerian theology, gods were not optional, not decorative. Gods were the structural beams of the universe. Take a major one out and the building begins to come down. The storm god is out. The building is coming down. So in the world above the broken sky, the king of the gods does what he has the authority to do. He calls the assembly, every divine being who answers to him, summoned by name, by rank, by title, to the place where the gods of the Sumerian universe gathered when the largest decisions had to be made, the court of the divine, the Ukin, the assembly hall in the heavens above Nippur where the great ones met. He summons all of them, and they come. Now we have to talk about the Anunnaki. We have to talk about them carefully, because in the modern world the word has been bent in strange directions. Attached to theories about ancient astronauts, secret civilizations, alien gold mines, hidden planets. Most of these stories were invented in the second half of the 20th century, the most influential of them by a writer named Zecharia Sitchin. Beginning in 1976, Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a hidden planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth to mine gold, who genetically engineered humans as a labour force, and who continued to influence world events from secret bases. None of this is in the actual Sumerian texts. The word Nibiru does exist in cuneiform, but it refers to a fixed point in the sky, probably the planet Jupiter, in late Babylonian astronomical compendia, not a hidden planet. The Anunnaki, in the actual texts, do not mine gold from Earth. They are not described as coming from another world. They are described as gods. What the Sumerians actually meant was something far older and stranger. In its earliest form, the word can be translated as princely offspring, the seed of the prince, or the children of the noble one. The noble one in this case was almost certainly An, the sky god, the highest god, the father of nearly all the others. So the Anunnaki in the original Sumerian were the descendants of the sky, the royal family of the universe. In the earliest surviving texts that use the term only slightly later than NEI 12501, the Anunnaki are the most important and most powerful gods of the pantheon. The text known as Enki and the World Order says they do homage to Enki, that they sing hymns of praise, that they take up dwellings among the people of Sumer. The same text says, twice, that the Anunnaki decree the fates of mankind. Decree the fates of mankind, a heavy phrase, V. It means the trajectory of any human life, its length, its direction, its successes, its catastrophes, was understood by the Sumerians to be set, at some level, by these beings. Not by individual choice, not by the local gods of small cities, by the great ones gathered in their assembly deciding. How many of them were there? This is harder to answer. Sumerian texts disagree. One source mentions 50 Anunnaki associated with the city of Eridu. Other sources describe 7, the council of the highest, usually listed as An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna. The sky, the wind, the deep waters, the Mother Earth, the moon, the sun, and the morning star. 7 cosmic forces in the form of 7 divine persons. There was also a complementary group called the Igigi, the lesser gods who laboured on behalf of the Anunnaki. In the Atrahasis epic, the Igigi rebel against the work the Anunnaki have given them, and human beings are created precisely so that the Igigi will be relieved of the digging, the canal clearing, the heavy agricultural labour on which the world above depends. The basic shape was hierarchical, the Anunnaki at the top, the Igigi below, with a complex middle full of named deities who could shift between roles. Other texts use the word more broadly. By later periods, the Anunnaki sometimes meant one specific group of gods, sometimes another, sometimes heavenly, sometimes chthonic, gods of the underworld, judges of the dead. In the famous descent of Inanna, the seven who fasten the eye of death on her are Anunnaki, but they are gods of the lower world, not the upper one. The picture is layered, centuries of belief built on top of each other, gods who shifted roles, gods whose number changed depending on who was telling the story. What runs through almost all of these usages is the same quality. The Anunnaki are the decision-makers, the ones whose word, when given, becomes destiny. The Sumerian universe was run by their assembly the way a great kingdom might have been run by a council of princes, gathered, debating, deciding, then dispersing. When Enki 12501 describes Enlil convening the divine assembly, this is the body he is convening, the descendants of An, the council that came to be known by the term Anunnaki, even where the word itself is not preserved on the broken tablet's face. The room, a vast hall, vaster than any earthly palace. Sumerian poets, when they tried to describe such places, used words like lapis lazuli, alabaster, shining bronze, walls that seemed to glow with their own light, floors of polished stone, pillars carved with reliefs of bulls, lions, the divine emblems of the great cities. Light pouring in from no visible source, the way light pours into the world in dreams. Around the hall, on thrones, sit the gods. An would be there, the Sky Father, the oldest. Sumerian theology held that any great divine assembly was convened in his name. Enki would be there too, the lord of the deep waters, the clever one. In many other myths, Enki is the trickster of the gods himself, the one who outwits, who saves, who finds the unexpected solution. When every other god refuses to help in the descent of Inanna, Enki acts, breaking the rules, fashioning the strange creatures who pull her out of death. In most traditions, he is the most reliable saviour in the Sumerian pantheon. Inanna may well have been there, the morning and evening star, the goddess of war, of love, of the marketplace, of crossing. The famous story of her own descent into the underworld would not be written down for several centuries after Ni 12501. But the tradition of Inanna as a goddess who crosses dangerous boundaries appears to have older roots, and her presence would be expected. Ninurta, the divine warrior, plausibly in the hall, the one who, in other tablets, fights monsters in the mountains and kills them with weapons forged by the gods. Strong, disciplined, trained, one would think, for descents into wild places. Nanna, the moon. Nergal, in some traditions the god of war and plague, who in later versions of the mythology becomes the husband of the queen of the underworld, and may have, of all the gods, the deepest personal familiarity with the lower world. Around them, the other Anunnaki, lesser deities, princes of cities, gods of crafts, of harvest, of music, of weaving, all present because the assembly has been called by the king himself, and at the front of the room, the king, Enlil, older than the others in a sense, though his age is not measured in years, the lord of the wind, the keeper of the office of lordship, the one who held the tablets of destiny themselves, the cuneiform tablets on which the fate of the world was inscribed. To say that Enlil ruled was to say that the universe ran on his decisions, the highest authority any Sumerian could conceive of. He stands now before the assembly, the face of a father in grief. His son is below. The storm god, the rain-bringer, his own offspring, has been taken to the place from which nothing returns. Above, the world is dying. The children are vanishing. The cattle are dead. The grass is brown. The rain has not fallen in months. He looks at the room of the most powerful beings in his universe, and he asks the question, who will go? Who among you will descend into the Kur? Who will pass through the gates? Who will face the queen below? Who will bring my son back? He waits. The hall is huge. Somewhere there is a sound, perhaps a cup set down on a stone table. Perhaps a robe rustling as someone shifts. Perhaps no sound at all. Just the breath, the held breath, the breath that becomes a kind of listening, and no one answers. Stay with this moment. This is the moment that, in 2024, became readable for the first time in 4,400 years. The moment that, when Matusak finally pieced together the broken signs and worked out the grammatical structure, made the tablet suddenly more interesting than anyone had realized. Hold the image, slowly. Let it come together in the dark behind your eyes. The king of the gods, standing, asking, the Anunnaki in their places, robes still, faces composed, their eyes, which in some Sumerian texts have a kind of weight, an ability to stop a creature with a glance, fixed not on Enlil but on each other, on the floor, on the carved walls, on anywhere except the answer. No one stands, no one speaks. The decreers of fates do not decree anything in this moment. They are silent the way a court is silent when a king has asked something the court does not know how to refuse and does not want to do. Why? The tablet does not answer directly. There is no passage in which Enki rises and explains why he will not go, in which Inanna explains why she will not go, in which Ninurta gives a polite excuse. The tablet just describes the silence. The refusal is collective, total, without dissent. But you can read between the lines. The Kur, the underworld, was governed by rules. Not just any rules, ancient rules, older, in some sense, than the gods themselves. The land of no return was called the land of no return because that was its first and deepest principle. Once you go, you stay. The doors close, the gates seal. Whoever crosses that boundary becomes part of what is below. Consider who governed below. The queen of the underworld was Ereshkigal. Her name means Queen of the Great Earth, or more loosely, Lady of the Great Place. In some traditions, she's the elder sister of Inanna. In others, a more distantly related figure. She is older than the upper world's social fabric in a way the surface gods are not. She rules from a palace called Ganzir, and she does not leave it. Does not visit the assemblies of An or Enlil. Receives no embassies from the upper world unless the upper world sends them down in fear. She is the only major Sumerian deity whose authority over her domain is, in surviving texts, almost never challenged successfully. She has officials. Namtar, her vizier, is also a personification of fate, the one who hands out diseases and decides when a mortal life ends. Neti is her gatekeeper, controlling who comes in and, occasionally, who goes out. Below them are demons of various ranks. The Gala, the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld who serve as judges, the wind demons of the wastes between the gates. The whole apparatus is formal. It runs on protocol. It runs on the law of the underworld itself, an ancient code of rules that even gods, if they enter the lower world, must obey. In the Descent of Inanna, written down a few centuries after Enwanna 12501 but drawing on older traditions, the goddess goes down voluntarily, perhaps to challenge her sister Ereshkigal. She passes through 7 gates, surrendering at each one a piece of her divine power. By the time she reaches the throne room, she is naked and diminished. The 7 Anunnaki of the underworld fasten their eye of death on her. She becomes a corpse, hung from a hook on the wall. Enki rescues her only by fashioning 2 strange small creatures who slip past the rules of the Kur because they are not properly alive in the first place. Even then, the underworld demands a price. Inanna cannot leave without a substitute. Her husband Dumuzi is taken, and his sister Geshtinanna, and the 2 of them spend half the year each below, alternating forever. That is the rule. You can sometimes get back, but there is always a cost. There is always a substitute. There is always something paid. The Anunnaki of Neo 12501 know this rule. They know that whoever descends will face the gates. The 7 judges, Ereshkigal herself, will be stripped of power, held, possibly substituted for. Even the most powerful gods can be killed below, as Inanna will be. Getting in is the easier half. Getting out is the part that has costs. So when Enlil asks who will go, what he's really asking is, who will risk being stuck? Who, of all of us, is willing to walk into the place that even gods cannot reliably escape? The answer, in that hall, is no one. Not Enki, who is wise. He may be wise enough to know that wisdom is not enough. Not Inanna, who is fierce. She may be fierce enough to know that fierceness is not enough. Not Ninurta, who is strong. strong enough perhaps, to know that strength is not enough either, not the moon, not the sun, not the gods of the cities, none of them. This is a kind of theological revelation hidden inside a story. The Anunnaki, the Great Ones, the Council of the Highest, are not omnipotent. There are places they cannot easily go. There are situations they cannot easily fix. There are powers in the universe not stronger than them, but older, more structural, more rule-bound, that even the gods must respect. The Kur is one of those powers. The Kur is what the gods themselves are afraid of. Read that sentence again and let it settle. The Kur is what the gods themselves are afraid of. This is the line the tablet whispers and never says outright. It writes it in the silence, and for 4,400 years almost no one read it. Kramer's book, all those decades, had been carrying this fact on its cover, in plain sight, to anyone who could decode it, and no one could until now. Their king stood before them, and his son was being held, and the world was dying, and they would not move. It is one of the most counterintuitive moments in the entire surviving body of ancient Near Eastern literature. The moment when the great ones become small. The moment when the all-powerful are suddenly not all-powerful at all. In the oldest stories, the gods were afraid of dying. In the oldest stories, the gods could lose. And into that long, awful, motionless silence comes one voice. A voice from low in the room, from among the small, the unimportant, the easily overlooked. A voice that says simply, I will go. The voice belongs to Fox, not a god, an animal. This is what makes the moment so strange. In every other assembly of the gods we know about, the speakers are gods. The decisions are made by deities. The volunteers, when there are volunteers, are the great ones. The fierce, the wise, the strong. The hero who saves the day in a Sumerian myth is almost always Enki, or Inanna, or Ninurta. Sometimes a king like Gilgamesh. Sometimes a special human chosen by the gods, like Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood survivor whose story closely parallels the later Akkadian Atrahasis, and in many of its bones, the Hebrew Noah. A fox does not belong in the room. A fox is not a god, has no temple, no city, no priesthood. In Sumer, a fox is the small, tawny, sharp-faced animal that lives along the irrigation canals and the edges of the marshes and steals chickens from the hen houses of farmers. To put it plainly, a pest. But Sumerian literature has always had a strange place for foxes. Few fox stories survive from the 3rd millennium BCE. Most of what survives from that period is administrative, ritual, or hymnic. By the 2nd millennium, foxes turn up in proverbs, in a substantial body of old Babylonian Sumerian sayings copied by students in the scribal schools. The fox in these proverbs plays the same role he plays in NY1 2501. Small, cunning, talking himself out of trouble. One famous proverb says, in effect, that the fox could not build his own house, so he came to the house of his friend as a conqueror. Another describes the fox urinating into the sea and claiming credit for the tide. Always overestimating himself, always claiming more than he has done, always slipping through situations larger animals could not survive. The fox is small, fast, and, this is the key to NA12501, ambiguous. Now, here is one of the most fascinating details Matuzak uncovered, and one of the most quietly stunning facts in all of Sumerian linguistics. The cuneiform sign for fox, the single wedge-mark sign that, in early Sumerian writing, meant fox. That exact same sign was also used to write the words for lie, treachery, falsehood. Same strokes pressed into the clay, read sometimes as fox, sometimes as lie, sometimes as deceit. A single shape carrying multiple meanings, and the ancient readers knew which was which by context. This means that to a Sumerian, sitting in a scribal school in Nippur or Eridu, the very category of fox was inseparable from the category of deception. When the scribe wrote the sign, he wrote both, the animal and the trick, the creature and the lie. They were one in the ground floor of the writing system, before the words above it had even been formed. This is, as far as we know, the oldest example in human writing of the trickster archetype being inscribed at the level of the script itself. The fox as trickster did not begin with Aesop. Aesop, who lived in the 6th century BCE, comes nearly 1800 years after NE12501. It did not begin with the European medieval Reynard, who is more than 3,000 years younger. Not with the kitsune of Japan, the trickster figures of Native American traditions, the Persian fables that were translated into Arabic and then into European languages. In a single language we can read, the trickster fox begins here, with NI 12501. The story of the fox who volunteers when the gods will not. He is in the room now, not a man-fox, not a human in a fox costume, an actual fox, small, tawny, sharp-eared, narrow-muzzled, eyes bright with calculation, walking into a divine assembly the way a small wild animal walks into a place it does not belong, low, careful, hugging the wall, watching everything, not afraid exactly, wary, the way only foxes can be wary, not the wariness of weakness, but of intelligence. He walks to the front of the hall, looks up at Enlil, says, in whatever way a fox speaks to a god in a Sumerian story, that he will go. The tablet does not give us a long speech. It gives us a moment, a volunteering, a small voice in a great hall, taking on what the great voices would not. Why? Why does a fox volunteer? The surviving lines do not say exactly, but you can guess. And the guess illuminates the whole story. The Anunnaki cannot go because they are too visible, too large, too clearly themselves. If Inanna goes, the underworld will know her, and we know from her later descent what happens. She is stripped at the gates, killed, substituted for. If Enki goes, the underworld will know him too. The same will be true of any of them. The gods cannot easily lie about being gods, but Fox can. He is small. He is, in the very script that wrote his name, a creature of falseness. He can pretend to be other than what he is. He can move through the underworld in a way a god cannot. Not because he is more powerful, but because he is more ambiguous, the only one in the room who is built for this. The strongest weapon against a place that obeys rules absolutely is not strength. It is cunning, the willingness to seem to follow the rules while actually circumventing them, the trickster's art. Enlil, looking down at this small creature who has come forward when none of his own divine children have, must understand. The answer to the underworld is not power, not authority. The small, fast, half-honest creature who can fit between the rules. He nods, or he gives whatever the divine equivalent of a nod is, and the fox goes, out of the hall of the gods, away from the assembly, away from the lapis lazuli columns and the polished floors, out into the world that is dying, the world without rain, the world where the children are vanishing. He begins to descend, to find the place where the rules harden into walls, to find the gates of the Kur. To picture what Fox now does, you have to picture the Sumerian underworld. This is where the imagination, working from the texts, gets to do its careful, dim, dreamlike work. The Sumerians did not draw pictures of the underworld, or if they did, the pictures are mostly lost. What we have are descriptions, phrases, moments in poems, the descent of Inanna, where the goddess passes through 7 gates, each guarded by a gatekeeper, each requiring her to surrender something. The later Akkadian descent of Ishtar, describing the underworld as the country where the dead live in darkness, eat clay, are clothed like birds with wings, sit in the dust eternally. We have from various texts the names of the officials who run it. Ereshkigal, the queen, Namtar, her vizier, Neti, the gatekeeper, the Anunnaki of the underworld who serve as judges and whose eyes carry the weight of death, the Gala who drag mortals down, Lamashtu, the child devourer, the wind demons of the wastes between the gates. 2 other texts fill in more of the picture. In the death of Ur-Nammu, written in honour of one of the great Sumerian kings, the spirit of the dead king arrives in the underworld and is given gifts to distribute to the various gods and demons he meets there. Weapons, jewellery, fine garments, the kind of things a king might bring on a state visit. He greets each underworld official, names them, presents the proper offering. The text reads, almost like a diplomatic protocol document. Even in death, the social order of the lower world has its courtesies. A king is received as a king. The dead are graded. There is hierarchy in the dust. In the myth of Nagal and Ereshkigal, a god from the upper world is sent down to apologise for an offence, and ends up, by a complicated sequence of events, becoming the queen's husband and co-ruler. That text gives us our most detailed surviving description of the bureaucracy of the lower world. The 7 gates, the 14 guards, 2 per gate, Namtar's negotiations, Ereshkigal's chambers. We have the architecture in pieces, an entrance located in some traditions in the eastern mountains, the Zagros, the great range that rises east of Mesopotamia. To go to the underworld was to walk east into the mountains until you came to the place where a staircase began to lead downward. A staircase, a series of steps cut into stone leading down into the dark. The steps go on a long way. The light fades, the air grows thick. 7 gates, consistent across nearly every text. 7 barriers between the upper world and the throne of Ereshkigal, each one with a guardian, each one with a ritual of passage, each one demanding something be left behind. A palace at the bottom, Ganzir, the Dark Palace, the seat of the queen, made of stone in some descriptions, made of darkness in others. The centre of the country of no return. This is what Fox is walking into. The surviving lines of NI 12501 do not describe his descent in detail. The tablet is broken in many places, and the moment of greatest narrative emphasis is at the gate, not on the road there, but the road is not hard to imagine. So follow him. Moving east, the land rises, the fields end. The cattle that were once full and content are skeletons in the dirt. Villages stand empty. Smoke does not rise from the ovens. Children do not run between the houses. The whole plain is in the silence that comes before complete abandonment. He walks for days, or weeks, or however long the walking takes in the dream time of the story, toward the mountains. The mountains, in Sumerian imagination, were always somewhat dangerous. The plains were the home of civilization, the cities, the canals, the temples. The mountains were the home of monsters, of foreign peoples with strange customs, of demons who had been driven out of the cities, of the entrance to the underworld. He reaches them, finds the staircase, begins to go down. Light fades by degrees. First the daylight is replaced by a kind of dim grey, like the light at twilight. Then the grey darkens. Then there is no light at all except whatever the stones themselves seem to give off. A faint phosphorescence, a sense of seeing without sun. The staircase is long. Sumerian descriptions stress the size of the underworld. Not a small place, not a single chamber, a country. A vast, cold country, with its own geography, its own settlements, its own internal landscapes. Some texts describe the dead as living in houses, in arrangements that mirror the upper world but in smaller, dimmer, dustier form. A parallel kingdom. Not the opposite of the surface, but its hollow, dark twin. Fox descends through this country. If his descent followed the older pattern, he would have moved from gate to gate, through the 7 thresholds that, in every other surviving description, separate the upper world from the lower one. He does not, in the surviving text, fight the gatekeepers. He does not, like Inanna, surrender his garments. He is not wearing garments of power, not dressed like a god. He is an animal. Perhaps he passes the gates simply because nothing about him triggers their attention. Too small to be challenged, too low to be stripped, too unimportant in the visual hierarchy of the underworld to be stopped. He moves down through the layered country of the dead, and he comes, eventually, to the place where the rules begin to be enforced, not through gates, through hospitality. In Sumerian thought, the underworld did not stop you with weapons, it stopped you with offerings. It offered you food, it offered you drink, and if you accepted them, really accepted them, took them into your body, made them part of you, then you became by that act a citizen of the country of no return. The Sumerians believed this with their whole imagination. To eat the food of the dead was to become the dead. The substance of the underworld, once consumed, bound you to it. The boundary between alive and dead, in Sumerian metaphysics, was crossed not by the soul, but by the stomach. What you ate determined what you were. This is what is now waiting for Fox. Not gates, not gatekeepers, a meal. The most dangerous moment in the descent is not the descent itself, it is the offering. The food is offered. The text does not describe the room in which it happens. It does not name the deity who brings the offering. It describes only the act, the bread, the water, and Fox's response. To understand the moment, you have to understand what the Sumerians knew about hospitality. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was sacred. To enter another person's house was to enter into a kind of temporary contract. The host was obliged to feed the guest. The guest was obliged to accept what was given. To refuse food was an insult, sometimes a deadly one. To refuse water was even worse because water was life, and to refuse life from a host was to suggest that the host was offering something poisoned, or worthless, or worse than nothing. This is not an abstract rule. It still operates in many parts of the world today. The traveller is given a glass and must drink. The unexpected guest is fed before being asked who they are. To refuse the simple food of the house is to mark yourself as something other than a guest, something cold, something not part of the human ritual that hosting represents. The hospitality of the underworld played on this exactly. The dead, through whatever divine mechanism, would offer food and drink to the living traveller. To refuse outright was to break the social code that even the underworld observed. It was to mark yourself, immediately, as an enemy, as someone who had come down for a fight, not as a guest. The 7 judges, the gatekeepers, the queen, would all know you were there for a confrontation, and they would respond accordingly. To accept and eat was to bind yourself. Either way, you lost. This is the trap, the elegant, ancient, terrible architecture of the Kur. You cannot refuse because refusal triggers detection. You cannot accept because acceptance triggers binding. The only options the place gives you are equally fatal, unless you are something other than what you appear to be. Unless you are, in the deepest etymological sense, the sense that goes back to the cuneiform sign, that means both fox and lie, a creature whose existence is founded on the possibility of being one thing while seeming to be another. Then you have a third option. The third option, in NI 12501, is what Fox does. He receives the bread, he receives the water. In whatever ceremonial way they are presented, he takes them. He performs the gesture of acceptance, treats the offering with proper Sumerian respect, does not refuse. There is no offence, no insult, no triggering of the gates of attention. To anyone watching, he is doing exactly what a guest is supposed to do. But he does not eat. He does not drink. Instead, this is the moment of the trick, the small, precise moment that makes NI 12501 unique. In surviving Sumerian literature, he places the bread in a bag. He pours the water into a water skin, keeps them with him, does not consume them. He performs hospitality without ingestion. He follows the form of the rule without crossing the line that the rule actually polices. He lies to the underworld with his body. The food is taken, but not into him. He is, in that moment, not a guest, not an enemy. A third thing, a creature who has discovered the loophole at the heart of the system. The Kur cares about consumption. Fox has accepted without consuming. So far as the rule is written, he is not yet bound. This is the most subtle trick in the surviving line of the tablet. It is also, scholars have noted, the moment when the tablet introduces, possibly for the first time in human writing, a literary motif that would become one of the most widespread tropes in world mythology. The forbidden food of the underworld, the rule that says, do not eat in the place of the dead. Eat there and you stay there. Refuse and you cannot pass. The tablet does not state the rule explicitly. The action makes no sense unless the rule is understood. Fox is hiding the food because eating it would bind him. The audience of the tablet sitting in their courtyards in Nippur 4,400 years ago must already have known, must already have had the cultural understanding that the food of the dead was a trap. Otherwise the action would be incomprehensible. So the rule is older than the tablet. It was already known to the Sumerians of the 3rd millennium BCE, part of their inherited cosmology. Where they got it, we do not know. From an even older culture, perhaps. From a tradition that goes back into the mist before writing began. From something so deeply human that it shows up everywhere. Because that is what is most striking when you look at this rule in the wider context of world mythology. It shows up everywhere. Travel forward in time, 2,000 years past the writing of NI 12501. You are now in Greece. The Aegean Sea glitters under the sun. Athens, Corinth, Thebes are walking, busy places. The poet Hesiod has lived. The poet Homer has lived. The Greek language, in its archaic form, is being written down in alphabets borrowed from the Phoenicians. Around this time, perhaps in the 7th or 6th century BCE, the Greeks composed a long hymn we call the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It tells the story of Persephone, the daughter of the grain goddess. Persephone is taken, against her will, by Hades, the god of the underworld. He pulls her down through a chasm in the earth to his dim, grey kingdom. Demeter, her mother, searches for her on the surface. In her grief, she withholds the harvest. Crops fail. Trees do not bear fruit. The mortal world dies slowly, the way the world died in NY12501. The other gods plead with Hades to let Persephone go. He agrees, but on one condition. Just before Persephone leaves, he gives her a pomegranate. He encourages her to eat. She bites into the fruit, swallows a few seeds. That act binds her. Once you eat in the country of the dead, you cannot fully return. Persephone is allowed to come up to the surface, but only for part of the year. The rest of the year, because she ate the seeds, she must return to Hades. The seasons of the Greek world are explained by this binding. Spring and summer are the months Persephone is above. Autumn and winter are the months she is below. The Sumerian fox refuses to eat. The Greek girl eats and is bound. The rule is the same. Travel further. To Japan, to a tradition called Shinto, to the foundational mythology of the Japanese imperial line. In the Kojiki, composed in the early 8th century CE but drawing on much older oral traditions, there is a story of the god Izanagi descending into the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Izanami. He finds her in the dark place called Yomi. She tells him she would like to come back with him to the world of the living, but she warns him. She has already eaten the food of this place. She cannot leave easily. The food of Yomi is binding. The cooking pots of the underworld are not simply pots. They are the instruments of permanent residence. To eat from them is to belong to them. Travel to Ireland, to the Celtic tradition, to the great body of stories about the cedar, the fairy folk who live in the green hills, in the hollow earth, in a country parallel to the human world. There are countless stories of mortals being invited to the feasts of the cedar. Musicians who hear the music coming up from inside a hill, wanderers who follow a path that they did not see before, into a green valley they did not know existed, and find themselves at a banquet. The rule, in every Celtic story, is the same. Do not eat the food of the fairies. Do not drink their wine. If you do, you cannot leave. You will dance for 100 years, while 7 decades pass for everyone you love. You will come back to a world that has forgotten you, or you will not come back at all. Travel to the Norse traditions, the Eddic poems, the stories of Hel, the daughter of Loki, who rules the world below. Travel to the mountains of Mesoamerica, to the world the Maya knew. The Popol Vuh, sacred book of the Kichi Maya, recorded in writing in the 16th century, but built from much older oral tradition, tells the story of 2 hero twins who descend into Xibalba, the underworld of the Maya. Xibalba is ruled by a council of dark lords. It has houses of trial, the Razor House and the Cold House, and the House of Bats, each one trying to destroy the visitor. The twins survive in part because they are warned, before going down, that the food they will be offered is not what it seems. They navigate the underworld by knowing, in advance, what to refuse. Travel to the Pacific. In the Hawaiian tradition, the goddess Hi'iaka descends into the lower world to retrieve a lover who has been lost. She's offered, by various spirits along the way, food and gifts that, if accepted, would bind her there. She refuses them and returns. Travel to West Africa, where the trickster Anansi has many dealings with the gods of the lower world, in stories that share the same logic of cleverness moving through what strength alone cannot. Travel anywhere, and the rule is there. Do not eat the food of the dead. The form changes. Pomegranate seeds in Greece, cooking pots in Japan, fairy bread in Ireland, the deceptive food of Xibalba. But the structure does not. To eat in the underworld is to be of the underworld. The boundary between worlds is policed not by walls or by guards, but by the mouth. Where does this rule come from? Why does it recur across so many cultures, on so many continents, in so many periods? Why do these traditions, separated by oceans and centuries with no obvious chain of contact, keep arriving at the same prohibition? There are many possible answers. Some scholars argue it reflects a universal human intuition about death, a sense, somewhere in our oldest minds, that consumption changes us, that what we take into our bodies becomes us. Others see the rule as a memory of ancient funerary custom, in which the food offered to the dead was understood to be irretrievable, given over, no longer ours. A third school grounds it in observations of dangerous foods. The sharing of unfamiliar plants in unfamiliar places, in early human migration, was often fatal, and the rule may encode a survival principle in mythological dress. A fourth view is psychological. The rule expresses a deep human awareness that grief itself can swallow you. that to feast at the table of loss is to take loss into yourself, that mourning has its own appetite. The rule, in this reading, is not just about literal food, it is about how we are shaped by what we consume of our sorrows. We do not know which of these explanations is right, or whether any of them is right alone. We may not be able to know. What NI 12501 shows us, with its small broken clay surface, is that the rule is at least as old as writing itself. Not the invention of the Greeks, not the invention of any single later culture. The inheritance of the Sumerians, who wrote it down before almost anyone else wrote down anything. And in NI 12501, they wrote about the only kind of being who could break the rule. The trickster, the fox, the small creature who could accept without consuming, who could hold the food in a bag and never take it into his body. The first being in literature to find the loophole in the oldest rule of death. This may be the most extraordinary thing about the tablet, that at the very beginning of recorded religious thought, the ancient mind already understood not only the rule, but the exception to it. Already imagined a being whose existence depended on bending the rule. Already saw, in some intuitive way, that the way to defeat death was not by being stronger than death, but by being more clever than death. A four-legged animal, a clever, lying, bag-carrying fox, with bread he did not eat and water he did not drink, going down to bring back the rain. And then the tablet breaks, just here, at this moment, at the moment of the trick, at the moment when Fox has taken the food, hidden it, and now must go on. The clay is broken on its lower edges and along part of one side. The text continues for a few more lines after the moment of hospitality, but then it crumbles. The signs become unreadable. The narrative thread is lost. Matuzak gives us those surviving lines. They are tantalizing. They suggest Fox is moving deeper, perhaps approaching the throne of the queen, perhaps the place where Ishka is held. There are fragments suggesting movement, decision, action, but the fragments do not cohere into a clear scene. And then, nothing. The story stops. The clay simply runs out. We do not know if Fox succeeded, whether he reached Ishkur, whether he carried the storm god out of the dark, whether the rule of the underworld caught up with him, whether someone eventually noticed that the bread was still in his bag and stopped him. We do not know if he came back at all. What we have instead is the absence. A story that was complete, that had an ending, that the scribe of NY 12501 finished writing, and that is now gone. The lower portion was broken away, possibly during the original burial, possibly during the centuries the city was abandoned, possibly during the rough excavations of the 19th century. Wherever it broke, those pieces did not come up out of the ground when the rest of the tablet did. They are dust, somewhere in the soil of Nippur, in pieces too small to identify even if we found them, or they may not exist anymore at all. Many Sumerian tablets were never fired in the first place. Sun-dried, preserved only by the accidents of building fires that baked them. The fired portion of NY 12501 survives. The unfired portion may have crumbled into nothing centuries before any archaeologist arrived. Whatever happened, the ending is gone. Matushak, being a careful scholar, does not pretend to know how the story finishes, but she has an opinion. After publishing her translation, she said in an interview, "I'm pretty optimistic that he'll manage to get out in the end. He's too smart to fall into the trap." She's reading this less as a literal narrative and more as a literary type. In every tradition that has produced the trickster, he usually wins. He usually escapes. He takes what he came for and gets out, often by the skin of his teeth. Aesop's fox wins. Reynard wins. The kitsune of Japanese tales wins. Anansi wins. Foxes in mythology do not usually fail. So Matasak's guess, and it is a guess, is that Fox brought the storm god out. The trick worked. The food was returned, uneaten, to the upper world, and Ishka came up with him. If that is right, then the rain returned. The cattle came back. The children stopped being carried below. The world that had been dying began to live again. But we do not know. It is one thing to read a story and know how it ends. To read the descent of Inanna and know that Inanna, after dying, comes back. To read Gilgamesh and know that Gilgamesh, after seeking eternal life, fails and accepts mortality. To read the Iliad and know that Achilles, after killing Hector, will die. The ancients had endings. We, the moderns, sit in their endings and look around. It is another thing to read a story and not know how it ends. to read the descent of Fox and know, not that he died, not that he survived, but that we cannot tell. The story exists in a state of suspension. It has been suspended for 4,400 years. It is, in some sense, the longest cliffhanger in the history of literature, a cliffhanger that has outlasted the city it was written in, the language it was written in, the religion it described, the empires that followed, the entire ancient world, a story still waiting, patiently, for someone to find the missing piece, knowing in some sense that the piece may never be found. There may be, somewhere in the unexcavated ground of Nippur, another tablet that contains the rest of this story. A duplicate. A copy. Sumerian scribal schools were, after all, places of copying. The teacher would write a tablet and the students would copy it, and if any of those copies survives, it might give us the ending. Or there may be, in some museum, in some drawer, in some collection that was hauled out of Mesopotamia in the 19th century and never properly catalogued, a fragment that fits with NI 12501. Many tablets have been split between collections. Different museums hold different pieces of the same original. With patience, with cataloguing, with international cooperation, fragments are sometimes reunited. The ending may not be lost, it may only be misplaced, or it may be gone forever. Both possibilities have to be held at once. In the meantime, Fox stands suspended in mid-descent. The bread is in his bag, the water is in his skin, the gates are above him, the throne somewhere ahead, and we cannot see whether he reaches it or whether he turns back. For 4,400 years, this is where he has been. Moving in the dark, carrying the food he will not eat, a strange kind of immortality. The clay has held him there, frozen in mid-stride at the most important moment of his story, because the ending of his story is gone. The broken tablet has done to him what the underworld would have done. It has held him. Step back. Widen out and look at what Nai 12501 tells us about the great gods of the Sumerian universe. In the actual text, the Anunnaki were powerful, authoritative, structural forces of the universe. Their names were spoken with reverence. Kings prayed to them, but they were not unlimited. Each god had a domain. Enki, the deep waters. Enlil, the wind and the office of lordship. Inanna, the marketplace and warfare and love. Outside their domains, their influence weakened. The Kur was its own domain, its own ruler, its own court, its own laws, its own Anunnaki who served as judges. Sovereign. Not subordinate to Enlil, not subordinate to An. Its own kingdom with its own laws, and even the king of the gods had to ask, not command, when he wanted something from below. NNI 12501 makes this clear with terrible economy. Enlil does not order the gods to descend. He asks, summons the assembly, poses the question, and waits to see who will volunteer. He cannot order, because he cannot enforce. The Anunnaki are not under his command in the sense that an army is under a general's command. They are a council, a body of equals who must be persuaded, asked, invited. When none of them volunteer, he does not, as far as we can see, force them. He does not threaten, he does not punish, he waits, and the only one who steps forward is a fox. What does this tell us about how the ancient Sumerians thought about their gods? It tells us that the Sumerians did not think of their gods as a totalitarian regime, as an omnipotent monarchy, as a single will imposing itself on the universe. They thought of their gods as a council, a family of beings, each with their own concerns, who could be summoned but not commanded, who could be asked but not coerced. A remarkably mature theological imagination, the imagination of a society that knew about kings and palaces and councils, that had seen with their own eyes the way real power works, that power, even at its highest, is negotiated, that kings, even great kings, must persuade their nobles, that an order is most effective when it is also a request. The gods of Sumer were modelled in part on the assemblies of Sumerian cities themselves. The early city-states of Mesopotamia were governed in some periods by something like a council of elders alongside the king. Decisions were debated, opinions were heard. The Akkadian poem Atrahasis, which preserves an even older Sumerian tradition, shows what such an assembly looked like in mythological form. When the gods debate whether to send the flood, they argue. They take votes, some object, some sulk, some plot to undermine the decision after it has been made. The assembly of the gods is a political body, with all the messiness real political bodies have. So when the Anunnaki of Na 12501 refuse to descend, they are exercising the prerogative of any noble in any council. This is too dangerous, and I will not go. The king cannot make me. The king must accept that this is my answer, a startling, deeply human moment. You may recognize it, even now after all these centuries. You know what it is to sit in a meeting where someone in authority has asked a question, and the question is whether anyone will volunteer for something hard and no one wants to. You know that silence. You know how it stretches. The Sumerians knew it too. They put it on a clay tablet. They put it at the heart of their religion. The gods, in their assembly, refused, and the saviour of the world, when the saviour came, was not the king, not the wise one, not the warrior, not the queen of love and war. The saviour was the small, ambiguous, slippery creature who lives at the edges, who is half trusted even now, whose very name is the same word as lie. Fox. That is the picture the Sumerians left us of their universe, not a hierarchy of ranked perfections, not a tower of glorious certainties, a council of great beings, most of them too proud, too powerful, too risk-averse to do the necessary thing, and one small clever creature, willing to go where the great ones would not. A humbling picture. Also, in its way, a hopeful one. If even in Sumerian theology the world is sometimes saved by the small and the clever rather than the great and the strong, then there is room in the universe for unlikely heroes, room for the trickster, room for the one who is small enough to slip past the rules. For those of us listening, 4,400 years later, in the dark, falling towards sleep, that may be a thought worth carrying. Widen further. Think about what NI 12501 means as a piece of evidence for the civilization that produced it. Sumer is one of those civilizations whose name almost everyone has heard, and whose actual nature almost no one knows. We say Sumer, and we mean, vaguely, something old, something Mesopotamian, something with cuneiform writing, something with ziggurats. We mean the civilization before Babylon, before Assyria, before all the names we recognize from the Old Testament. But what was Sumer really? Sumer was the world's first urban civilization. Around 4000 BCE, 6,000 years ago, in the floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates, the first cities began to form. Settlements that had been villages grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. By 3000 BCE, the largest, places like Uruk, are estimated to have held tens of thousands of inhabitants, with monumental temples, central administrations, complex economies, and writing. Writing was invented there. The earliest cuneiform, the impressing of wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets using a cut reed as a stylus, emerged in Sumer around 3200 BCE. It was first used for accounting. Records of how many sheep, how many bushels of grain, how many jars of beer. Within a few centuries the script had expanded enormously. Personal letters, administrative correspondence, royal inscriptions, hymns to the gods, then, eventually, longer narratives, stories, myths, the body of literature we now call Sumerian. By 2400 BCE, by the period of Ni 12,501, the Sumerian cities were sophisticated, ancient and self-aware. They had been around for more than 1,000 years already. Their own histories, their own traditions, their own scribal schools, their own canon of texts considered classic. Not new, old. The cities at that time, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Umma, Nippur and others, were each politically independent. Each had its own king, its own patron deity, its own dialect, its own slightly different way of doing things. But they shared a culture, a language, a writing system, a religion. Their kings went to war with each other regularly, but they used the same gods to bless their armies, the same calendars to mark their seasons, the same scribes, drawn from the same training, to record their victories. This was the summer that produced Moise 12,501. By world historical standards, an advanced civilization. The base 60 mathematics that we still use today for measuring time and angles, Sumerian. The technology of irrigation that fed the cities, Sumerian. The legal codes that governed daily life were beginning to take shape, and would soon produce some of the earliest written laws in human history. Astronomical observations that would later inform Babylonian astronomy were already underway. Standardized weights, standardized contracts, the early concept of interest on a loan, all came from this period or just after it. The literature in some ways is more sophisticated than modern readers expect. Not childlike, not naive. The literature of a civilization that had been telling stories, writing them down, debating them, and refining them for many centuries. Intricate hymns, complex myths, philosophical dialogues, satirical proverbs, lyrical love poetry, bitter laments. The prototypes of nearly every literary form that would later appear in the Mediterranean world. NI 12501 is one tablet from this enormous tradition, and it is a unique one, the only tablet in which the storm god Ishka appears as the central figure. Why does this god, mentioned in countless other texts, only have this one story? We do not know. Other Ishka narratives may have existed and not survived, or this may be it. Ishka was a relatively minor god in the south. The major mythological cycles concerned other deities: Inanna, Enki, Enlil, Gilgamesh, Dumuzi. He was a god you prayed to, but not a god you wrote epics about. NI 12501 may be the lone exception. A story written in Nippur, where his father Enlil was the patron, and where therefore his mythology was somewhat more elaborated than elsewhere. If that is the case, then the tablet is doubly precious. Possibly the only narrative that ever existed about Ishka in extended form. The one moment when the storm god was briefly the protagonist of a story. And that story is the story of his disappearance, his captivity, his being held in a place beneath the earth until a small clever creature is sent to retrieve him. There is something beautiful and something melancholy in this. The minor god gets his moment, and his moment is a moment of helplessness. He is the subject of the story, but not the actor. The held one, the waited for one. The reason the divine assembly meets, but not himself a member of the assembly that meets. He waits in the dark while the council debates above him. This is perhaps the experience of everyone who has ever been ill or trapped or imprisoned, or simply unable to act in their own life. To be the reason for things, but not the doer of things. To be at the centre of others' decisions, but not a decider yourself. To wait in some dim place for someone to come. Viewed this way, NI 12501 is a quietly profound story. Not just about gods and underworlds, about the experience of being held, and the question of who, in the great council of those who could move you, will actually come. Most of them will not. In any council, in any story, in any life, most of them will not. But sometimes one will. Come back slowly to the tablet itself. NI 12501 still exists. Today, in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums. It has not moved. It has not changed. Sitting in its drawer, the way it has sat since the late 19th century. Still small, still broken, still made of dried mud from the floodplain of southern Iraq, mixed perhaps with chaff or fine sand to keep it from cracking, pressed by a cut reed in the hand of someone whose name we will never know. Think about what that piece of clay has been through. It began in a riverbed, the Euphrates, or one of its branches. The fine silt of the river, deposited over thousands of years. The Sumerians dug into that silt, mixed it with water and chopped reeds, and made the basic substance from which their entire civilization was built. Mud bricks, walls, houses, temples, tablets. A specific lump of that clay was set aside, maybe in a scribal school in Nippur, maybe in a private library belonging to a temple, shaped into a small rectangular lozenge, perhaps 3 or 4 inches across, the size of a thing a young scribe could hold while he wrote. A scribe took it. Probably young. Most of the scribes who copied tablets in Sumer were students working through their training, sitting in courtyards with their teachers and copying the texts that had been given to them. The teacher was called the Ummiyah, the master. There survive, from the old Babylonian period, school dialogues in which a student boasts of his knowledge, complains about the food, mocks his classmates, and struggles with his Sumerian verbs. The world of the scribal school was a real, lived, sometimes funny, sometimes brutal place. Tablets came out of it not from detached clerics but from tired students, copying under the eye of stern teachers, with the cane never far away. This particular scribe, on this particular day in roughly 2400 BCE, was given the text of the Ishka story. We do not know if he was copying it from memory, from a teacher's dictation, or from an older tablet placed in front of him. We do not know if it was a school exercise or a finished commission. We do not know if he was good at his work or sloppy. What we know is that he wrote it down. He pressed his stylus into the clay and made the wedges one after another in the careful order of cuneiform. He wrote about the rivers full of fish, about the cattle of Ishkur, about the storm god being taken to the Kur, about Enlil summoning the assembly, about the silence, about Fox volunteering, about the bread and the water and the bag and the water skin. At the moment we cannot see, he wrote what happened next. Whatever it was. He wrote the ending. Then he set the tablet aside. Maybe it was fired by accident in a building fire. Maybe it was simply sun-dried and left somewhere. He died, and the city changed, and the centuries began to pass. 2400 BCE became 2300 BCE. Sumer was conquered by the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, often described as the first true empire in human history. Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, the high priestess of the moon god at Ur, became the first writer in human history whose name we know, composing hymns whose authorship she signed in her own voice 4,300 years ago. New rulers came to Nippur. New tablets were written. The old ones, including, perhaps, NI 12501, were stored or moved or forgotten. The Akkadian Empire fell. Sumerian rule returned briefly under the third dynasty of Ur. Then Ur itself fell. The Old Babylonian period began. Hammurabi made his laws. Marduk of Babylon rose to be a great god. Older Sumerian myths were translated into Akkadian and recopied. The original Sumerian texts were preserved as ancient monuments. Enati 12501 was somewhere in Nippur lying still. Centuries piled on centuries. The Kassite dynasty came and went. The Assyrian Empire rose, conquered, and built. Assurbanipal's great library at Nineveh was filled with thousands of tablets, but Ni 12501 was not in it. The tablet stayed in Nippur, or somewhere near it, in whatever corner of whatever temple or house it had ended up. Nineveh fell. The Babylonians took over. Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon. Alexander conquered Persia. The Seleucids ruled Mesopotamia, then the Parthians, then the Sasanians. The Sumerian language had been dead for 2,000 years by then. The Arab armies came in the 7th century CE. Mesopotamia became part of the Islamic Caliphate. Baghdad rose, the great capital of the Abbasid period, and for centuries the largest and most important city in the world. The site of Nippur was, by then, just a mound in the desert. People did not live there anymore. Goats grazed on its grass. Bedouin passed by it. Children played on its slopes. The mound preserved its tablets. Centuries passed. The Mongols came. The Ottomans came. The mound got higher. The wind blew sand on it. Rain, when it came, washed pieces away. In the 19th century, the European archaeologists arrived. From Pennsylvania, from London, from Berlin. They cut into the mound. They pulled out tablets, thousands and thousands of them, and shipped them across the world. NI 12501 was among them. It went to Istanbul because Mesopotamia was then part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman rulers had begun insisting that artifacts found on their territory be deposited in Ottoman institutions, placed in the Istanbul archaeological museums, given its number, set on its drawer. And it waited there. For Samuel Noah Kramer, sometime in the early 1950s. For Jana Matasak in the 2020s. For us, listening in 2026. 4,400 years from the day a young scribe pressed it with his stylus, you are hearing the words on its surface. Think about that. Almost no story has waited that long for an audience. Almost no clay has held its words that patiently. Almost no piece of writing has come to us from so far away, with so much intact and so much lost. The tablet is, in its way, a kind of relay runner. It has carried this story across the longest distance any object has ever been asked to carry one. It dropped most of what it was asked to carry, but the part it kept, the silence, the volunteering, the bag of bread, the water skin of water, it kept perfectly. The signs are still readable. The words still mean what they meant. You are receiving a message a Sumerian scribe sent into the future, with no expectation that anyone would ever hear it. The eventual audience that all writers secretly hope for. The audience who hears the story long after the writer is dust. The scribe is dust. The civilization is dust. The temples that housed his tablets are mounds of mud. The language he spoke has not been heard aloud in any natural conversation for more than 4,000 years. But the story is alive again. You are carrying it now. As long as anyone in any future century hears it, the fox keeps walking, the cliffhanger keeps holding, the assembly of the gods keeps sitting in their silent room, with their questions still in the air. There is one more thing to say before we close. It is about endings. Modern audiences have been conditioned to expect them. Stories, in our world, end. Movies end, novels end, songs end. Even a story that ends ambiguously, a film that fades to black on an unanswered question, has been deliberately designed that way. The ambiguity is part of the artistic intention. NI 12501 is not like that. The tablet was not designed to end where it ends. The scribe who wrote it had an ending. He wrote it. He probably copied it from a teacher who had it from a longer tradition in which the story went on for many more lines and resolved and finished in some specific way. The ending was real. The ending existed. It is just that we do not have it. This is a different kind of unfinished. Not the unfinished of artistic ambiguity, the unfinished of physical destruction. A whole, complete object has been broken, and the missing pieces are gone, and we are reading the remainder. This is, when you stop to consider it, probably the experience we're going to have with most of human history. We do not have all of the past. We have fragments of it. Archaeologists pull pieces out of the ground, one at a time, and from the pieces we try to build a picture. The picture is always incomplete, always provisional, always a guess at what the whole thing might have looked like, based on what survived. Almost everything we know about ancient civilizations is partly imaginative reconstruction. We have to fill in the gaps. We have to make guesses. We have to live with not knowing. NI 12501 makes this concrete. We cannot pretend the gap is not there. The lower portion is broken away. The lines are gone. We do not know. What does it mean to live with that? It means perhaps accepting that some of the most important things will always be partial, that we may never get the full picture, that patience, not impatience, is the appropriate response to the past. It also means recognizing that missing endings have a kind of integrity of their own. A story whose ending is lost is not a failed story. It is a story that has reached us with a particular shape, the shape of the broken, that contains within itself a kind of meaning. The fact that we do not know what happens to Fox tells us, among other things, that endings are not guaranteed, that stories, like lives, can be cut short by accident, that the universe does not always provide us with closure. The Sumerians may not have intended NNI 12501 to be a meditation on the impermanence of meaning. The scribe may have hoped simply that his tablet would last and his story would be read in full. By the accident of breakage, the tablet has become something more than what its maker intended, a meditation on what we have and what we have lost, and what we may never be able to retrieve. That kind of accidental wisdom is one of the special properties of ancient artifacts. They become, over time, more than themselves. Not because they have new powers, but because the centuries that separate us from them imbue them with new meanings. A potsherd, a statue, a clay tablet. None of these were originally philosophical. They became philosophical over time, as their original context faded and only they were left. Injannai 12501 is an artifact like that. It teaches us about the gods of the Sumerians, and, in the process, about our own assumptions about gods, about the tricksters of the ancient world, and the deep continuity of human storytelling, about the underworld and its rules, about translation and patience, and the slow work of recovering lost languages, and along the way about humility. It teaches us, through its broken edge, about the nature of endings, about how some endings are given to us and some are taken away, about how the absence of a final scene is not the same as the absence of meaning. It is sometimes a meaning of its own. There is a particular feeling that comes from sitting with a story whose ending you do not have. A kind of openness, a kind of waiting, a kind of permanent attention. As long as the ending is unknown, the story remains in some sense alive, capable of going in any direction, capable of becoming anything. When stories have endings, they are settled, placed on shelves, filed. We finish them and we move on. When stories do not have endings, they keep us with them. They keep asking us. They keep, like the fox in the dim corridor of the underworld, suspended in his moment of cunning, asking what happens next. NI 12501 will keep doing this, As long as the tablet survives, the story will keep being told and keep being interrupted. Future scholars will find new fragments, perhaps that shed light on related myths. Future readers will sit with the broken edge and feel its weight. Future listeners, on whatever evening of whatever year, will hear about Fox and his hidden bread and the missing ending, and will go to sleep with the question still in their minds. That is perhaps the truest gift the tablet gives. Not closure, continuation, the right to keep wondering. We have been with this story for a long time tonight. Let it close, slowly. Somewhere in Istanbul, a small piece of clay about the size of a hand lies in its quiet place in a museum collection. Around it, the city is going about its life. Markets, ferries, calls from the minarets, cars in the traffic, lights along the Bosphorus. Above it, planes are passing. Far below, the foundations of the city sit on layers of even older cities going down. The tablet does not move. It does not know what time it is. It does not know that you have just been listening to its story. But the story it carries, the story it has been carrying since approximately 2400 BCE, has just been told in your hearing. The fox has descended. The bread has been hidden. The water has been hidden. The gates have closed behind. The throne is somewhere ahead. The storm god is somewhere in the dark waiting. Whether Fox makes it back, we do not know. Whether the rain falls, we do not know. Whether the children in the upper world are saved, we do not know. What we have, finally, after 4,400 years, is the question. The question is enough. Some questions are bigger than their answers. Some questions have been waiting for the patient ear. This one has waited a very long time. If you are still listening, if your eyes are heavy, if your breath has slowed, if the room around you is darker than it was when we began, then you have done something. The Sumerian scribe of Sediasnvul 12501 hoped someone would do, even if he could not have imagined the form it would take. You have given the story a place to be. You have let the fox walk through your imagination. You have let the silence of the gods sit for a while in your mind. You have held, for a few minutes or a few hours, a moment of 4,400-year-old human wondering, and you have let it be alive again, in your own century. That is enough. The clay does not need anything else from you. You can rest now. Let the tablet sit in its drawer in Istanbul. Let the fox stand suspended at the gate of the underworld. Let the assembly of gods sit in their endless silence, with the question still hanging in the air. Let Enlil grieve, and Ishka wait, and the rivers run dry, and the rain be on its way back somewhere in some lost portion of the story. None of it requires you to be awake. The clay has been patient for so long. It will be patient for one more night. In the morning, when you wake, the story will still be there. The fox will still be walking. The gates will still be sealed. The bag of bread will still be uneaten. The missing ending will still be missing. Perhaps for another 4,000 years. Perhaps until tomorrow. Perhaps until some careful archaeologist somewhere lifts a small piece of clay out of the dirt and brings the rest of the story home. Until then, sleep well. The Anunnaki are silent in their hall. Fox is moving in the dark. The rain has not yet fallen. But it will. In some lost line of clay somewhere in some part of the story we do not have, it will. Sleep.